Before we get started, I have a very important question to ask you. And I tried to research it online, and there just unfortunately was no answer. And the question is, atayef or kanafe? And be careful when you answer.
It depends from where, right? I mean, I've had some really horrible kanafe, but typically I like kanafe.
Good answer. Good answer.
What are Arabs and Muslims across America talking about behind closed doors? Well, they have something to say. I make sure it gets said. I'm Noor Goda, and I believe real talk gets us real solutions. Join me on Between Arabs, where I come to talk taboo with and about Arabs and Muslims in America.
Assalamu alaikum, marhaba, and welcome back to the Between Arabs podcast. This is episode 25, Arab in America with Khaled Beydoun. Before we get started with the podcast, a couple of quick announcements, especially if this is your first time tuning into the podcast. Want to let you know where you can find more of the content that is being produced at the Between Arabs project. First, visit us online, www.betweenarabs.com. That is the main hub where you can then access the blog, the podcast, and the YouTube channel. We're a multimedia platform for discussion. Our mission is to develop a more engaged, empowered, and united Arab and Muslim community in the West by having candid intra-community dialogue that is rooted in empathy. The project has been around for a little over a year, so fairly new and still in its infancy. But alhamdulillah, we've had some great people join us on the podcast and some amazing writers who have written for the blog. And now I have started to vlog for the YouTube channel a little bit more consistently. So if you haven't checked that out, go ahead and check it out. Leave a comment, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Anyway, let's get started. I am so excited that I had the opportunity to chat with Professor Khaled Beydoun. He is a prominent figure in the Muslim and Arab American communities, and he himself is a Muslim Arab American and a native of Detroit, Michigan. Beydoun is a law professor, an author, a public commentator, and a critical race theory scholar. His work examines the racial construction of Arab and Muslim American identity, criminal and national security policing, counter-radicalization, and the intersection of race, religion, and citizenship. And his scholarship has been featured in top law journals, including the California Law Review, the Michigan Journal of Race and Law, the Stanford Journal of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and much more. A commentator on pressing issues, Professor Beydoun contributes regularly to Al Jazeera English, serves as an expert consultant for the U.S. Census Bureau, and has featured his opinion pieces in the New York Times, Washington Post, and the BBC. You can find Professor Beydoun on Twitter at Khaled Beydoun. That's KhaledBeydoun. He's also on Facebook, Khaled Beydoun. And he's got two upcoming books that will, inshallah, come out early next year. The first is a reader on Islamophobia. And the second is a text entitled Why They Hate Us, The Rise and Roots of American Islamophobia. And I'm super excited to snatch those once they come out, especially the second one. We do talk about it briefly during this episode. Hi, Khaled. How are you?
Hi, Noor. How are you?
I'm doing well, alhamdulillah. Okay, so does this mean that you're Palestinian?
No, I'm actually Egyptian and Lebanese. Yeah, so Palestine would be in the middle. So I guess unofficially Palestinian.
Unofficially Palestinian. Well, yeah, especially if you grew up in Detroit, right? There's a huge population of Palestinians out there.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, I grew up with many Palestinian friends.
Mm-hmm. Why don't we actually start there? What was it like growing up in one of the most concentrated Arab American communities in the United States, and then now as an adult, as a scholar, an activist, a writer, in a very dense Islamophobic atmosphere? What's the change been like for you?
Yeah, so, growing up, I grew up in Detroit, right outside of Dearborn. So it was different, I guess, in many ways. I kind of grew up in, the center, the hub of Arab America, but also the center of, African America.
Right.
Kind of at the crossroads of, two of the most concentrated of color communities in the country. So, and also in a very, poor to working class kind of context. So the economic dimension had a big deal to do with, my upbringing and, also what molded my commitment to social justice. So part of it was racial, part of it was religious, but a big piece of it was also socioeconomic. But it was, despite, there being a lot of challenges, obviously, I think it was a wonderful way to grow up, because obviously, for me, I spoke Arabic at home. I went to the mosque Friday school, so I was always kind of, in tune with my religion, language, culture, and so on. And also, I think just maybe part of the reason why I'm kind of honest and like almost fearless with the way I speak up on things is because growing up, there were very few white people, right? So I wasn't kind of like suppressed and stifled by this ubiquitous reminder that we are in a white supremacist country. I grew up in a majority minority area. So, maybe in retrospect, that seeded my ability to kind of speak freely and honestly about issues linked to white supremacy.
For sure, definitely. And you mentioned growing up in an area that was not just heavily populated by Arabs, but by African Americans. So as a critical race theorist, could you give us some information and language around how we as Arab Americans can understand the political events and the political situation that we're in now in light of African American history and the plight of African Americans specifically? So
there's really deep connections, right? And I think that, so I'll tell you a story and maybe that'll be helpful. So a couple of weeks ago, I was in Toronto to give a community lecture to not only Muslims, but a pretty diverse audience up there in Toronto. And I talked about African Americans, Arab Americans, Latino Americans within the Muslim experience in very distinct ways, right? I was kind of constructing those racial groups as exclusive and kind of standalone groups. And then afterwards, I was two sisters came and spoke to me.
Uh-oh.
And they were like, yes, I was getting ready. I put the defense up, getting ready to get to business.
the arched brow. I'm waiting for it.
Yes. I was raised by my mom and my sister, so I know when I'm getting ready to get in trouble from women. So I was weighing there, and they're like, you know what, Khaled, we really enjoyed your presentation. However, we identify as Black Arabs. These were sisters who were, definitely unapologetic about their blackness, but also acknowledged that they belong to the Arab diaspora, right? And this is something I typically do. Like, I'm very critical of the idea, kind of this American racial imposition that you have to choose one race and that you don't belong to one race. Like, you're either Arab, you're either Black, you're either Latino, and you can't be two or more, right? But for me, like, that was a really important reminder that, okay, we think about, Black and Arab as, completely exclusive and distinct classifications. And there are issues, obviously, right? There are issues that, you and I can discuss about tensions, anti-Black racism within the Arab community, frustration by Black Muslims, which is, definitely something that's come to the fore in the last couple of years. But not for us to also ignore and be knowledgeable, cognizant of the fact that there are, in perhaps a significant percentage of people in this country and beyond it, that identify as both Black and Arab. So to kind of acknowledge that overlap, I think, is really critical. And these two sisters reminded me of that.
Yeah, for sure. Intersectionality is such a huge component of, I think, understanding what's happening in the United States, especially for Muslim millennials. And I guess in your experience, what kind of tensions have you seen within the greater Muslim American community around understanding race politics and intersectional identity?
Yeah, so I was blessed to have learned directly from, kind of the mother of intersectionality, Kim Crenshaw, right? She was my professor in law school, and she's my mentor now, and she's somebody I work really closely. So, I can just say generally, like, I'm really kind of heartened by the fact that, intersectionality has become a term that is, widely stated. It's achieved a lot of kind of like mainstream resonance within, activist spaces. That above all, I think is such an amazing development, especially because 5 years ago, intersectionality was a term that, academics threw around, right?
Right.
So to see this term in, other kind of framings, be understood by young people and millennials and so on, just demonstrates that I think, these young millennial activists, understand activism and understand, coalition building across racial lines, across religious lines, in a way that is far more advanced than, my generation or even previous generations. And I think a lot of that has to be attributed to the Black Lives Matter movement, right? I think that mobilized not only a coalitional consciousness, but also kind of mainstream the language of intersectionality, white supremacy, white privilege. Mm-hmm. These terms that were only confined to academic spaces. The Black Lives Matter really kind of thrust into the popular imagination.
Definitely. Yeah. And as you said, there is a huge uprising within the Muslim community to partner and ally with those who began the Black Lives Matter movement. So one of the arguments that I often hear among Arabs and Muslims, at least here on the East Coast, is the argument about black on black crime. So I'm interested to hear from you as someone with a background in law, as a professor of the law. What is your response to this argument?
Yeah, it's kind of a false equivalency, right? Because I think, look, the root of these issues, the root of police violence, the root of the disproportionate incarceration of black and brown men and women, the root definitely of Islamophobia and national security policy that presumes that Muslim identity is correlative of terrorism. It's not a person-to-person phenomenon, right? It's not something you can link or construct in a binary that it's community versus community. It's community versus system, mm-hmm. right? So when you say black on black crime, what you're doing is you're not only placing liability on other individuals who are who kind of lack agency and lack the ability to reform system, pass legislation, reform police departments, and so on, right? But you're also kind of glossing over the fact that there are real institutions in place that essentially pit black people against black people, right? That enable gang violence to be concentrated in the spread in poor inner city contexts. You ignore the idea that part of the process of black people being incriminated, being arrested at a high rate, being shot down at a high rate, whether it's by white policemen or other black youth. Mm-hmm. The real source of all of this is the idea that you have institutions that are enabling this kind of thing, but also indirectly institutions that are being shut down that exacerbate this problem. So, for instance, when let's talk about Chicago or Detroit, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. It's no surprise that places like Detroit, Chicago, New Orleans, Baltimore, and so on, have a high incidence of, black victimhood, and also black victimhood as a consequence of other black men and women, right? But again, these are spaces where the schools are being shut down at an alarmingly frightening rate, right? In Detroit, we've had 70 of the 140 schools shut down in the last 10 years. Wow. So if young youth don't have option to kind of matriculate through school and go on to college and find gainful employment through the conventional means, then of course other options like gangs, like drugs, are going to be the only outlet for these people to take care of their families and provide for their families. But again, it's the system that creates these kinds of ultimatums where these individuals are forced, essentially, they're compelled to engage in criminal activity to pay the bills.
Absolutely. So the other, I guess, branch of this situation or this conversation is there seems to be a misalignment among many of the Muslim leaders in our community, whereby the same sort of leaders will hesitate or outrightly reject the alignment with, let's say, the LGBT cause. And the Black Lives Matter movement in particular was founded by 2 lesbian women. And so there seems to be a conflict of interest, for lack of a better phrase. And so I'm just curious to hear from you as somebody who is a part of the community. What's your thought on that misalignment?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 questions in there that I've kind of identified, right? The first question is how Muslim American leadership isn't necessarily delivering on bringing about the racial kind of justice and I guess kind of healing the wounds across racial lines. And then the second question is, I think a really difficult kind of challenge that sits on the horizon for, I guess, liberal factions of the Muslim American community is, how do we, integrate into this broader, liberal progressive movement?
Or is that even something that we want?
Yeah, exactly. And is it something that can be done, entirely? I mean, one thing I've really been thinking about, and I won't answer those questions in order, but inshallah I can come back and answer the first one is, right now, it's kind of like the Arab Spring, right? Like if you think about like the Arab Spring revolutions, if you think about, it's easy to get kind of disparate elements on the same page once there's a common enemy in place, right? So, for instance, in Egypt, you had secularists, you had the Brotherhood, you had the intelligentsia, you had really bougie Arab living in Egyptians living in Ma'adi, all kind of congregating to get rid of the common enemy, right? But as soon as Mubarak was gone, things kind of fractured all over again. I kind of see the same thing happening around Trump, to be honest with you, right? Especially with regard to how previously kind of reluctant and even oppositional elements toward the Muslim community have really embraced Islamophobia in full form, right? One thing that really concerns me is, and I think you've identified one of those primary concerns is, look, after this, whether you want to call it a honeymoon phase or a phase of considerable crisis because of Trump, I think Muslim American leadership is going to be taken to the task about how they stand or where they stand on a series of issues that are cornerstone issues with regard to the broader progressive movement. And that is, obviously LGBT identity, second, anti-Black racism, and third, I guess, like related to the first one, just homophobia at large and whether, LGBT Muslims can be integrated into the community in a mainstream way, right? Our leadership hasn't been taken to task on these issues now because everybody's kind of in, high alarm mode, focused, sure, kind of keeping your eyes on the prize on Trump. But once this fades a little bit, Muslim American leadership who have really embraced and are definitely not only embraced it, but are clearly a big part of it, they're going to be taken a task on where they stand on these issues. And their answers are going to be really pivotal because if they deliver answers that aren't to the liking to the progressive mainstream establishment, that might notice a moment of, kind of retrenchment away from non-Muslim liberals and progressives with regard to championing Islamophobia and other issues.
Right. And do you think that has the potential to fracture the Muslim American community?
I think it does, right? And I think there's really important debates happening within the Muslim community about these issues, right? I think much of it is you have scholars who, understand the scripture and are reviewing the Sharia in a close way to see if there is religious justification to support some of these issues, right? And I think that's important, right? To be, honest with the letter of Islamic law is really important. It's for those who, really take, the letter of Islamic law to have great weight, right? And then you have individuals who aren't as devout, aren't as like wed to the scripture, who are just kind of more led or, kind of more guided by secular liberal ideals and principles. So you might see a divide, along these lines. But I think, look, I wouldn't call it a divide necessarily, right? I think that, like all communities, it's important to have a range of views. Intellectual heterogeneity is a good thing. And we're not a monolith clearly along racial or ethnic lines. Then, why should Muslim Americans be a monolith along political or intellectual lines?
Thank you. Tough question, but I appreciate your candor there. So let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about the work that you, I believe, are still doing at IRDP, the Islamophobia Research. So you're there and you're working alongside some pretty incredible scholars like Jaideep Singh and Hatem Bazian. And one of the things that sometimes I think frustrates me, it's a microaggression that I need to get past, but the word Islamophobia. doesn't really capture the nuances and the root causes of what we're experiencing. And I really, really appreciate Jaideep Singh's phrase Islamo-racism, because I think, one, it draws on the parallels between the essence or the roots behind this agenda that is a complete social construct, right? Race. And it just happens to fall on the heads of Muslims at this particular point in time. So could you distinguish a little bit between the term Islamophobia, Islamo-racism, how it's used, and as scholars at IRDP, what sort of work you're doing along those lines?
So there's a lot of, there's a range of, almost kind of competing definitions of Islamophobia that are being offered by scholars, right? So one of them is Islamo-racism. There's a great book by Eric Love called Islamophobia and Racism in America that is
coming out soon. Yeah,
it's coming out next month at NYU Press.
Awesome.
Which, aligns with that definition, that Islamophobia is racism, based on, the racial construction of Muslims as being, Arab/Middle Eastern, others, outsiders, interlopers, what have you, right? I think the racialization of Muslim American identity is an important kind of dimension of this broader system of Islamophobia, but I think it's only one dimension. Like my definition of Islamophobia, and I wrote this article, and I'm writing a book actually that inshallah will come out maybe, I don't know, like in maybe half a year if I can get to where I have a more legal and comprehensive definition of Islamophobia, right? So Islamophobia is in part private, right? It's the way we kind of think about and imagine Muslim American identity, and much of that is racialized, right? And it's private in the sense that specific private actors envision Muslim threat in a very specific way, right? That is tied to clearly long entrenched, embedded Orientalist tropes of Muslims as being Arab, Middle Eastern, immigrants, interlopers, outsiders, and so on. But that's only one dimension of it, right? Then because you also have structural Islamophobia, or kind of analogizing it to how we think about institutional racism, right? The way Islamophobia functions from within the state. Structural Islamophobia is a critical dimension that is kind of neglected, I think, by many scholarly definitions of Islamophobia. It's a second dimension, I think, the most important dimension of my definition, because it's propagated by laws, policies, programs like the Patriot Act, like, counter extremism, like NSEERS, like Muslim Bans 1 and 2, even before 9/11, like the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, right? Legislation which is based on this baseline that Muslim identity is presumptive of terrorism or terror suspicion. You can't deny that the state is also engaged in Islamophobia by way of law, policy, and programming. And it's a critical kind of, component of the broader definition, because this is not irrational, right? What the state is doing is not irrational.
Right.
It's not. It's actually the opposite. It's very rational, because it's constructing and caricaturing Muslims as threat to advance specific foreign policy objectives, but also domestically to advance very specific and cogent national security objectives. So it's very intentional and it's very rational in the sense. And then finally, my definition has a third dimension called dialectical Islamophobia. It's how these laws, policies, and programs being advanced by the state, authorize the private Islamophobia we see unfolding on the ground. So, for instance, when a program like CVE says that individuals who are specifically devout or pious Muslims have a high inclination of becoming radicals. This is law, right? And in America, we're taught to obey and follow the law. So if the law is telling you that religious Muslims are inclined towards radicalism, that's essentially instructing to individuals on the ground, private citizens, hate mongers, soccer moms, that if you see a woman wearing a headscarf, there's a higher prospect of her becoming a radical. If you see a Muslim brother donning a beard or wearing a thobe down the street, high prospect that he's also a radical. So the law, structural Islamophobia, authorizes, it endorses, and during times of crisis, it actually emboldens private Islamophobia.
It resembles eugenics in so many ways. I mean, I'm listening to you talking about this, and the idea, the notion that we can look at somebody and based on their physical appearance, we can draw these very wide and serious and insidious conclusions about their potential behavior, things that they haven't even done. So for Muslim Americans, what do you believe is our responsibility as far as demanding our civil liberties? And is it our responsibility to educate non-Muslims?
I think so. And I think it's also ingrained in our faith, right? Like the idea of da'wah is to perpetually educate non-Muslims about the way we think about our faith and so on. So, you'll find a lot of activists say it's not my responsibility or obligation to do that. I take a differing viewpoint. I mean, maybe because I'm an educator, right? So, a big part of the reason why I chose teaching and activism is because I try to use whatever platforms I have access to to educate. But I think, beyond the obligation to educate, I think it's also important, and I think I see it happening now, that Muslim Americans are kind of looking beyond conventional bounds and spaces to build solidarity, right? And, again, I'll point to the Black Lives Matter movement, where you saw non-Black Muslim youth, students, and activists, really championing that issue in an important way. And it had reciprocal benefit. It wasn't only a thing where we were benefiting the movement for Black lives, but Muslims who were involved also, got really, important on the ground training and education about, how white supremacy being unleashed on Black communities also impacts non-Black Muslim communities,
Absolutely.
Right? So there was a reciprocal benefit from that. And I think, it's important for Muslim Americans to perpetually contemplate and think about issues that don't directly impact us.
Right.
And kind of, be there for other marginalized communities. And we saw some of that in Standing Rock, right? I was really heartened to see, like many Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, travel to Standing Rock, and champion that issue in a way that I think 10 years ago wouldn't have happened. So we're seeing a lot of things, a lot of like really progressive developments happening in real time during a time of great crisis. So, just inshallah, I hope that forward momentum can keep pushing forward.
Absolutely, inshallah. If there's really just one thing that Arab Muslims and Arab non-Muslims can do to strengthen the diaspora, what would that be?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, one thing that I really spend a lot of time on and care about is, look, we have a large number of Arab and Muslim Americans who are struggling with poverty and working class identity. And I think that there's kind of an inclination for people to kind of divorce the socioeconomic dimension from the plight of the broader plight of struggling with Islamophobia, policing, surveillance, and immigration, and so on. That I think that I really push for, activists and everyone to think about how these programs and policies, acutely impact poor and working class Muslim American communities. And we saw that in real time after the first Muslim ban, right? Me and colleagues of mine were speaking, racing, tending to issues in poor and working class Muslim communities. These people had no clue what the law, many of them had no clue what the law actually said. Many of them thought that the country they came from, whether it be like, Lebanon or, countries not listed on the actual executive order, were being impacted and were sending false information to their friends and family because they couldn't afford to hire an attorney. And many of them didn't speak English, right? So I think moving forward, it's really critical to not only acknowledge, but to do important work in these economically disadvantaged Arab and Muslim American spaces.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for bringing that up, because socioeconomics is definitely one of those issues that falls under the radar. And similar to you, I grew up, in an inner city around Black and brown folks, non-Arabs mostly. I didn't have the luxury or the privilege of growing up around very many Arabs, but whenever I was fighting for social justice, it was always shoulder to shoulder between Hispanics and African Americans. And, that always had or was always wound up with poverty. So it's something that hopefully Arab Americans don't lose sight of. And that's it. Thank you so much, Khaled. It was an honor and a privilege being able to speak to you tonight.
No, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Inshallah, we'll have a chance to do it again. Thanks so much, Noor.
Ma salama. Bye-bye.
Take care. Ma salama. This was another episode on the Between Arabs podcast with Noor Juda. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the bell. Also visit betweenarabs.com for more podcast episodes. Until next time, keep talking taboo. Assalamu alaikum and peace be unto you.